The Weight of Walls. A story of the Mongol conquests. The greatest victory is that which requires no battle. But if a battle must come, let the enemy's heart break before his walls do. Attributed to Genghis Khan. Zhongdu, northern China. Spring, 1215. Every night for 43 nights, Meng Shufu climbed to the top of the eastern granary and counted stars. It was not a habit born of wonder. It was born of dread. The stars did not change. The stars, he had decided, were the one thing the Mongols had not yet reached. He was 51 years old. He had survived 3 floods, 1 famine, and a plague that had emptied the lower quarter of Zhongdu so thoroughly that grass grew between the paving stones for a decade before anyone bothered to pull it up. He had outlasted a governor who taxed grain at sword point and a subsequent governor who taxed it at twice the rate with a smile. He was, in the particular way of men who survive everything, not especially grateful for any of it. His daughter, Rui, brought him a cup of warm water each evening before his climb. She did not ask why he climbed. She was 17 and had her mother's pragmatism, a woman who had died in the second flood and left Meng Shufu with a daughter, a stock of dried millet, and the working conviction that the universe was indifferent to human preferences. "The soldiers say there are drums," Rui said on the 44th night, handing him the cup without looking up from the loom. "There are always drums somewhere," Meng Shufu said. "These drums are to the north." He looked at her then. North was where the walls were thickest. North was where the Jin dynasty had poured its treasure and its labor for the better part of a century, building fortifications that a man could walk 3 abreast along the top of, walls so deep at the base that engineers claimed a tree planted against them would be an old tree before the roots found the other side. North was where Commander Heshili Zhezhong had stationed the best of the garrison's cavalry, 40,000 men who could ride in formations that shook the ground like approaching weather. "How far north?" he asked. Rui finally looked up. Her eyes, in the lamplight, were her mother's, close enough that the drummer boys can hear each other. That night, Meng Shufu did not climb to count stars. He sat instead at the base of the granary and listened to the city breathe. Zhongdu at night was not a quiet place. The capital of the Jin emperors, home to 1.5 million souls, it hummed and clattered and stank and prayed at all hours in dozens of languages. But tonight there was a quality to its noise that he recognized without being able to name. It was the sound a crowd makes when everyone in it has heard the same rumor, and no one has yet decided whether to believe it. He thought about his dried millet. He had 83 days of it, if they were careful. He thought about the walls. He thought about the drums to the north. He did not sleep. The news came properly, officially, with proclamations and garrison riders. 2 mornings later, the Mongol force under the great Khan himself had crossed the passes. They numbered, the proclamation said, somewhere between 80,000 and 300,000, which told everyone listening that no one actually knew. The Jin court, the proclamation assured them, was taking appropriate measures. The walls of Zhongdu were impenetrable. The army was prepared. Citizens should conduct their affairs normally and report any persons spreading seditious panic to the nearest garrison post. The market price of grain doubled before noon. By evening, it had doubled again. Meng Shufu sold his loom, north of Zhongdu, the same week. The Mongol officer's name was Jebe, though he had not been born with it. He had been born Jirko Adai, the son of a herder in a clan that no longer existed in any meaningful sense, absorbed into the web of the great Khan's confederacy the way rivers are absorbed by the sea, losing their name, losing their banks, becoming something larger and less personal. The name Jebe had been given to him by the Khan himself, after Jirkoadai had shot the Khan's horse out from under him in battle, and then, captured, confessed to the act without flinching, and offered to serve the man he had tried to kill. Temujin, already becoming Genghis Khan, already becoming the thing that would consume the world, had laughed and made him a commander. Jebe meant arrow in the Mongolian tongue. The man who shot at me, the Khan had said, is the man I want shooting for me. Jebe was not a man given to philosophy. He was a man given to problems and their solutions, which is a different thing and, in his experience, more useful. The problem before him now was a walled city of considerable size whose defenders had food stores for at least a year, walls that his cavalry could not scale, and a morale that had not yet broken. The city had not surrendered. It would not surrender. The Jin court was still in it, and where the court was, pride was, and where pride was, men convinced themselves that the situation was different than it looked. He sat with his sub-commanders in a felt tent 3 miles from the outer walls and laid out what he knew on a piece of treated leather stretched flat by 4 tent stakes. The city. The gates. 9 of them. The river that ran along the western edge, too shallow for boats but deep enough to complicate a cavalry charge. The granaries, which his scouts had roughly located from the movements of distribution carts. The wells. The northern wall is their strongest, said Mukali, the youngest of his sub-commanders, a man whose face still had the smooth quality of a person who had not yet spent enough winters outdoors to be weathered by them. They will expect the main assault there. Then that is where we will make noise, Jebe said. And the real assault? Jebe was quiet for a moment. He looked at the leather map. He looked at the positions he had marked for the siege engines, the catapults built by the Chinese engineers his forces had incorporated after the fall of Yanjing, engineers who had crossed over not with great anguish of spirit, but with the pragmatic flexibility of skilled men who understood that talent survives the death of empires. The real assault, he said, begins with fear. The Mongol method was not chaos. It only looked like chaos from the outside, which was the point. Within the army, there was an almost precise quality to the management of terror. Which populations to spare entirely, which to scatter, and which to destroy so completely that the smoke could be seen for 3 days' ride in every direction, functioning as its own message, its own proclamation, requiring no riders, no words, no translation. In the villages north and northeast of Zhongdu, in the small farming communities that supplied the city with rice and vegetables, and the particular kind of honest labor that feeds civilization without appearing in any historical record, the Mongol outriders had arrived 2 weeks earlier. They had been quiet and organized. They had not burned. They had taken the men of fighting age, not to kill them, not yet, but to gather them, to collect them the way one collects lumber before a construction project. They had taken some women too, and some older men who knew the roads, and they had sent them south toward the city they had come from. Not as prisoners, exactly. Not yet. As a message that had not yet been delivered. Zhongdu. 3 weeks later. Meng Shifu was at the north wall when they appeared on the horizon. He had been conscripted into the labor gangs shoring up the base of the northern defenses. Every able-bodied man in Zhongdu between 15 and 60 had been. And he was carrying stones when the soldier above him on the parapet made a sound he could not immediately identify as human. He climbed up. He looked out. The crowd stretched from one edge of his vision to the other. He could not, at first, understand what he was seeing. His mind offered him several explanations, and then took them back, because none of them fit. It was not an army. There were no banners, no formations, no glint of organized armor. It was not a refugee column, because it was too orderly, moving in a mass rather than a stream. It looked, from this distance, like the city itself was somehow walking toward him, like the fields and villages that fed Zhongdu had gotten up and were returning home. Then he saw the riders on the flanks, and he understood. The people in the crowd, he could see faces now, as they drew closer, were his people, farm families, merchants from the river towns, laborers, old men, children, women with children strapped to their backs in the way women from the northern villages always carried their children. They walked in the way of people who have been walking for a long time and have stopped thinking about where they are going because the destination no longer seems like something they have any say in. They were between 100 and 200 yards away now. Behind them, perhaps half a mile back, was the leading edge of the Mongol force, a darkness on the plain that resolved, as the eye adjusted, into men on horses, thousands of them, waiting with a patience that was somehow more frightening than any charge. "Archers," said the wall commander, a young Jin officer whose name Meng Shifu had never learned. His voice had the careful flatness of a man trying to hold himself together by the quality of his diction. "Archers to the north parapet." The archers came. They knocked their arrows. They looked out over the crowd of farmers and merchants and children, and they did not shoot. "Commander," said one of the archers. He was an older man, with a gray beard, and the hands of a career soldier, hands that had done this work for 20 years without hesitation. "Commander, those are—" "I know what they are," the officer said. Silence. The wind off the plain carried faintly the sound of weeping. A child somewhere in the crowd was crying. The sound was remarkably clear. The acoustics of open land before a high wall are strange. Sounds travel in ways that seem to violate reason, arrive with an intimacy that distance should prevent. "If we fire," said the archer, "we fire on." "I know," the officer said again. And he said nothing more for a very long time. Meng Shifu stood on the parapet and watched the crowd approach. He was trying to find, in the mass of faces, anyone he recognized. He did not know why. Recognition would change nothing. But he searched anyway, because that is what humans do. They look for the known face in the crowd of strangers. They reach for the particular, even when the particular is swallowed by the general. They insist on specificity, even when events have made specificity meaningless. He found a face. A man about his age, a grain dealer he had sold to 3 times a year at the autumn markets. The man's name was Wei Boken. He had a wife and 2 sons who helped him at the stall, and he always complained about the weight of the bushel measures. He claimed Meng Shifu's measures were heavy, which they were, and Meng Shifu had always told him he was imagining things. Wei Bochen was looking up at the walls. He was not calling out. He was not reaching toward them. He was simply walking forward, because the riders on his flanks would not permit him to stop, and he was looking up at the walls of his city with an expression that Meng Shifu recognized as the final stage of a particular kind of understanding. The understanding that comes when a man realizes that there is no version of events in which he is not the one who pays the price. The archers did not fire. The crowd reached the base of the northern wall. Behind them, at a measured distance, the Mongol forces began to move. Zhongdu. That evening, they brought Meng Shifu to the council because he was literate and because the garrison adjutant, a man named Pu Xian, had seen him on the parapet and had the impression, correct, that he had recognized someone in the crowd below. This made him, in the adjutant's calculation, a useful person to have present at what was about to happen. What was about to happen was a conversation through the eastern gate. The Mongols had sent a rider ahead, a single rider, under no flag, because the Mongols did not use flags of parley. They simply sent a man who was not carrying a weapon, and whose bearing made clear that the arrow aimed at him from the wall would, if released, produce consequences the archer's grandchildren would still be paying for. The rider carried a message from the officer commanding the vanguard. The message, read aloud by the adjutant in a voice scrubbed clean of all expression, was as follows. The people currently sheltering against your northern wall are the productive population of 43 villages in the territories north of this city. They have been treated well. They are unharmed. They will remain unharmed if the gates of Zhongdu are opened before dawn tomorrow. The Jin garrison will be permitted to march out with their weapons and their honor intact. The court will be escorted north under guard. The city's wealth belongs to the Khan, but its people are the Khan's subjects and will be so treated. If the gates are not opened before dawn, the village's people will be returned to the plain, and the assault will proceed. We have sufficient provisions and patience for this undertaking to conclude in whatever time it requires. You do not. The council chamber was a functional room of gray stone that had been used for administrative purposes for 3 centuries and showed it. The men seated around its central table were a governor's aide, 2 Jin military commanders, a court official, and the adjutant Pu Xian. Meng Shifu stood against the wall. "We cannot open the gates," said Commander Hexilia Zhizhong. He was a large man with a general's manner, the habit of speaking in declaratives, as though reality were a document he could simply correct. "If we open the gates, the Jin dynasty falls. This city is the capital. Its fall is the dynasty's fall." "The dynasty may already be falling," said the court official, speaking to the table surface rather than to anyone at it. "We have walls," Hexilia Zhizhong said. "We have 40,000 cavalry. We have food for—" "We had food for 14 months 6 weeks ago," said the adjutant quietly. "The population has swelled by perhaps a third with refugees from the north. I would estimate our food reserves now at 7 months, perhaps 8 if we begin rationing today. Then we ration." "At which point," the adjutant said, "morale—" "I am not interested in morale as a concept. I am interested in whether those walls hold, and they will hold." Meng Shifu looked at the backs of his hands. He thought of Wei Bochen, sitting against the base of the northern wall in the dark, waiting for a dawn that would resolve into either mercy or slaughter, depending on whatever these men decided in this stone room in the next few hours. "May I speak?" he said. Everyone looked at him as though they had forgotten he was there. "Who are you?" Hexilia Zhizhong said. "A grain dealer, from the market district." "Then you may not speak." "I knew one of the people against the wall," Meng Shifu said, and did not stop. "A man named Wei Bochen. He is not a soldier. He is a man with heavy bushel measures who drives a hard bargain and has 2 sons and a wife, and has never, to my knowledge, done anything to attract the attention of history. He is against that wall tonight because he lives in the wrong place at the wrong time, and what happens to him tomorrow depends on what we decide in this room tonight." The council members looked at him. None of them spoke. "I understand that the dynasty matters," Meng Shifu said. "I understand that walls matter. I have carried stones for those walls. I understand that if the gates open, Something ends that cannot be rebuilt in a generation or perhaps two. I understand all of this. He paused. But I stood on that parapet today, and I watched Wei Bochen's face, and what I saw there was not a man who believes that the dynasty will save him. I saw a man who already knows what the arithmetic of this situation produces. The arithmetic, Hexilia Zhezhong said slowly, is that the arithmetic is that the people against the wall will die if we fight, Meng Shifu said, and then more people inside the wall will die. And then, after a sufficient number of people have died, the walls will come down regardless, because walls are made of stone, and stone is patient, but stone does not grieve, and the people defending it do. He heard his voice as though from a distance. He was surprised by how steady it was. You can hold the walls. The Mongols can wait. They have waited out cities before. They will wait out this one. And the only question is what Zhongdu looks like when the waiting is over. The silence in the room had a specific texture. The texture of men who know that what they are hearing is true and are in the process of deciding whether truth is relevant to their purposes. Hexilia Zhezhong said, "Remove this man." They removed him. He stood in the street outside the Eastern Gate building, in the dark, in the noise of a city that was beginning to understand what the morning would bring. He could hear, from the direction of the northern wall, the faint sound of people who had been pressed against stone all evening, and were now, in groups, finding ways over or under or through. Guards who had looked the other way, ropes dropped by soldiers who had made their own arithmetic, and arrived at their own answers. The population the Mongols had used as their weapon was flowing back into the city like water finding cracks. They would not open the gates tonight. He understood that now. The dynasty's pride would not permit it. The commander's honor would not permit it. The city would fight. The walls would hold for a while, and then they would not hold. And the question that had seemed like a choice, resist or surrender, would eventually be taken out of everyone's hands by the patient, grinding logic of siege warfare, which was not a logic of moments, but of months. He walked home through streets that smelled of fear and cooking fires and the particular metallic edge that comes into city air when the people in it are deciding, each privately, how much longer they intend to stay. The road south. 4 months later. Meng Shifu left Zhongdu in the 9th week of the siege, when the food rationing had progressed to the point where a man his age was receiving enough to maintain himself at just below the threshold of full function. Enough to live, not enough to carry stones. He left with Rui and 11 other people from their district through a gap in the southern wall that the garrison had officially sealed and unofficially left penetrable. Because the soldiers manning it had children, and the children had noticed that the stores were depleting faster than the commander's proclamations admitted. He carried what he could carry. He did not look back at the walls as they went. He had decided, sometime in the 7th week, that looking back at things was a habit he could no longer afford. The road south was not empty. It was a river of people, flowing away from the city at the walking pace of those who have abandoned most of what they own and are left with only what their bodies can carry. Children, old men, women with bundles. Here and there a cart with a horse that still had something left, surrounded by people who had fallen into the cart's orbit because moving near horsepower felt marginally safer than moving through the open countryside alone. They stopped the first night in the ruins of a village he did not know the name of. The buildings were intact, but empty, not burned, not torn down, simply vacated, as though the people in it had one day decided, unanimously and without discussion, that they were done with it. The fields around it showed signs of cultivation that had been interrupted at an odd moment, crops half-harvested, tools left in the earth, a millstone still in the position of use. The village had been abandoned in an instant, as quickly and completely as water vaporizing from a hot pan, leaving only the pan. Rui found a house with a roof and a hearth, and enough fuel stacked by the door to suggest that whoever had lived there had left with some expectation of returning. She built a fire. The 11 people from their district gathered around it, and several other travelers who had seen the smoke came and sat at the edge of the circle without being invited and without being turned away, because at a certain level of shared extremity, invitation becomes a formality that events have made irrelevant. An old man from a town 3 days' walk to the east told them about Yanjing, how the Mongols had offered terms, how the terms had been refused, how the siege had lasted until the city could not feed itself, how the end had come not with a dramatic assault, but with a kind of systemic collapse. The garrison dissolving not from defeat in battle, but from the gradual disintegration of the social architecture that kept armies coherent. The belief that orders would be followed, that supply would continue, that the men to your left and right would be there tomorrow. That belief, the old man said, had a weight limit. You could pile so much on top of it before it stopped holding. "They say," said a woman across the fire, young, perhaps 20, with the look of someone who had been educated and was in the process of re-evaluating everything that education had given her. "They say that after Yanjing, the city to the north of my town sent out riders the moment they heard. Sent out riders to find the Mongol advance and offer surrender before the army was anywhere near them, before there was even a scout in sight." "They heard what?" Meng Shifu asked. "Everything," she said. "The farmers who got away, the merchants, the soldiers who deserted before the end. They carried the news south and east and west, and the news traveled faster than the army. And everywhere the news arrived, people made their calculation." She looked into the fire. Some decided to fight. Some decided to open the gates. The ones who decided to fight. She stopped. "Are the smoke we can see from 3 days away," the old man finished. The fire crackled. The wind moved through the absent village's empty lanes. From somewhere out in the fields, a dog was making a sound low in its throat. Not barking. Something underneath barking. The sound of an animal that had organized its entire existence around the presence of humans and was now confronting an incomprehensible absence. Meng Shifu thought about the word terror. He had always understood it as an emotion, a feeling that happened inside a person. He was beginning to understand it differently, as a substance, as something that could be manufactured and transported and deployed, as deliberately as grain or stone or iron. The Mongols made fear the way other armies made arrows. They stockpiled it. They calculated its trajectory. They understood that it traveled faster than cavalry, penetrated further than siege engines, and did not require feeding or rest or the maintenance of morale. They had turned the oldest, most intimate human fear, the fear of what happens to the people you love when power turns its attention toward them, into a military technology. And they had refined it with the patience of engineers, testing it against city after city, learning from each application what worked and what did not, adjusting the formula the way a craftsman adjusts a tool until it fits perfectly in the hand. The genius of it, if genius was the word, and he was not sure it was the word, was that it required the victim's cooperation. It only worked because the people on the walls could not bear to fire on their own. It only worked because the empire of the Mongols was built, brick by brick, on the accuracy of their understanding of human love. They knew that defenders would hesitate, so they made the hesitation into a weapon. They knew that news of destruction would spread, so they made certain the destruction was thorough enough to spread correctly. They knew that survivors would tell the story, so they made survivors, deliberately, and sent them south and east and west like seeds. And here he was, a seed. He fell asleep by the fire some time before midnight and dreamed, briefly, of Weibotchen at his market stall, arguing about the weight of measures, his sons laughing at the argument, the whole ordinary scene bathed in the specific quality of light that belongs to autumn markets, low and golden and smelling of harvested things. When he woke, the fire had burned to coals, and the woman across from him was also awake, sitting with her knees to her chest, watching the embers the way people watch things they do not expect to see move, but cannot stop watching. "My name is Meng Shifu," he said. "I am a grain dealer from Zhongdu." "I know who you are," she said. "You spoke to the council. My uncle was in the room." He looked at her. "Did it matter? What I said?" She considered this honestly for a moment. "Not to the council," she said. "But my uncle remembered it. He told me what you said, and I remembered it too." She paused. "That's something." He supposed it was. He could not, at the moment, determine what kind of something, but he supposed it was something. In the morning, they kept walking south. Epilogue: What the Empire was made of. Zhongdu, 1215. The steppe, later. Zhongdu fell in the summer of 1215. The walls held longer than anyone expected, and less long than the garrison had promised. The end came not in a single dramatic assault, but through the progressive collapse of the city's interior logic. The way a structure that has been undermined does not fall dramatically, but settles asymmetrically, finding new load-bearing arrangements that hold temporarily and then don't. The Mongol forces entered through the southern gates first. The soldiers who had been promised they could march out with their weapons and honor mostly kept their weapons. The honor was a more complicated thing. Commander Hashili Zhejiang was captured. The court official whose name Meng Shifu had never properly caught was not found. He had, it was later reported, left the city 3 weeks before the end with a small party of riders, heading west toward the Jin court's fallback position. Whether this counted as foresight or abandonment depended on who was telling the story and to whom. The city itself was not destroyed. The Mongols found it more useful intact. As an administrative center, as a granary, as a node in the network of the empire they were assembling with the same patient thoroughness they had applied to its disassembly. The 1.5 million people who had lived in Zhongdu before the siege, reduced by perhaps a third through flight, starvation, and the internal violence that attends the final stages of sieges, were now, efficiently and without excessive ceremony, subjects of the Mongol Khan. The engineers who had built the walls were assessed for competence and retained. The scholars were assessed for knowledge and retained. The soldiers who had not fled and had not died were assessed for reliability and provisionally retained. The tax collectors were replaced with Mongol tax collectors who used a different system that was, depending on the payer's perspective, either more or less equitable than the Jin system had been. Life reorganized itself around new facts. This is what life does. Meng Shifu spent 3 years in the south before returning. He returned because Rui had married a trader from a city that was now, technically, part of the Mongol Empire, and the trader had connections in Zhongdu, and the connections suggested that the grain trade in the city's reconstituted markets was producing margins that a man with experience and 83 days of surviving in his bones might find workable. The city he came back to was recognizably the same city and not the same city, in the way of things that have changed entirely while keeping their form. The streets were the same streets. The walls, repaired, in some sections entirely rebuilt, now maintained by Mongol garrison engineers, were the same walls. The eastern gate was the same gate. The stone administrative building next to it, still in use as an administrative building, its gray functional rooms now housing a different kind of administrator, filling out different kinds of forms, in a different language for a different empire that would, in its turn, fill the gray stone rooms with its own specific texture of power. He found Wei Bochen at the autumn market. The man was older, 3 years older, which sounds like nothing but is everything when those 3 years contain what those 3 years had contained. He had one son with him. The other son, he explained without elaboration, was not available. His measures were still heavy. They argued about the weight of the measures. It was, Meng Shifu thought, the most ordinary conversation he had ever had, and it was the best conversation he had ever had. And those two facts were, he decided, not unrelated. Somewhere on the steppe, north, always north, in the direction that had produced the drums and the riders and the impossible army. A man who had been born Temujin and had become something that would take centuries to fully understand sat in his tent and listened to the reports from his commanders. Zhongdu, Samarkand, already in the sights of the western divisions. The engineering corps, expanded now with craftsmen from a dozen conquered peoples, capable of breaking walls that had never been broken. The census of the new empire's subjects, being compiled by the scholars his administrators were assembling from every court they absorbed. He was not a man given to reflection, except in the specific way of men who have organized their lives around a single overwhelming purpose. Not self-reflection, but strategic reflection, the constant backward review of what had worked and what had not, and why. He was reviewing, at this particular moment, the reports from the cities that had opened their gates without resistance. There were more of them with each campaign. The ratio of gates opened to gates broken was improving in a direction that pleased him, and he understood why. The empire did not grow only through conquest. It grew through reputation. The reputation was built through conquest, selectively, carefully, with attention to what stories the survivors would carry and where they would carry them. The terror was real, but the terror was also a message, and the message had to be calibrated. Too much destruction, and you ruled rubble. Too little, and you lacked the necessary weight. The calculation was ongoing. Every campaign was data. Every city that opened its gates ahead of the army's arrival was a validation of the formula. He thought of the farmers who had walked ahead of the army toward Zhongdu's walls. He thought of the archers on those walls who had not shot. He thought of the stories spreading south with the refugees, arriving in city after city before any scout or messenger, doing the work of siege warfare without requiring a single siege engine. Fear was not enough on its own. Fear without calculation was merely cruelty, and cruelty was inefficient. It created resistance where none had been. It destroyed what you needed to use. It turned subjects into enemies. Fear with calculation was something else. Fear with calculation was a letter you sent ahead of your army, written in the language every human being was born already knowing how to read. It said, "We are coming. Here is what has happened to others. Here is the choice that others faced. Here is what remains of those who chose badly." And then it said, in smaller letters, the thing that made it work. You still have a choice. The empire was built on that sentence, on the pause it created, on the moment when a defender on a wall looked out at the approaching crowd and understood that the Mongols had, with terrible ingenuity, made the defender's own love into the instrument of his paralysis, had taken the most human impulse, the refusal to harm the innocent, and made it into a siege engine more effective than any catapult. You could not fight that. Not with walls, not with cavalry, not with food stores or engineering, or the accumulated military wisdom of dynasties. You could only decide, before it arrived, what you valued more than your walls, and live or not live with the answer. The Khan listened to the reports. He issued instructions. He ate and slept, and in the morning he issued more instructions because an empire of this size required constant management. And he was, above all things, a manager of men, of fear, of the vast logistical machinery that turned the terror of the steppe into the administered reality of a civilization that would, at its height, stretch from the Pacific to the Danube and encompass more human beings than any political structure in the history of the world. Most of those human beings, millions of them, had made their choice before the army arrived. They had read the letter, they had opened the gate, and they had woken up the next morning to discover that the world continued, different, changed, reorganized around new facts, but continued. This, in the end, was the Mongol Empire's most complete victory. Not the cities it broke, but the cities that broke themselves, quietly, in the night, before anyone had to be told twice what the alternative looked like. The thunder of cavalry was the sound everyone remembered. The silence before the gates opened was the sound that mattered. The Weight of Walls. A work of historical fiction based on documented accounts of the Mongol sieges of 1211 to 1215.